Welcome to today's episode, where we're diving into a book that's deceptively simple, yet profoundly transformative. The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. If you've ever felt trapped by your own thoughts, constrained by societal expectations, or just generally stressed about, well, everything, this episode is for you. Published back in 1997, this little book has sold over 8 million copies and has been translated into 46 languages. It's been featured on Oprah, recommended by countless therapists, and probably sits on your spiritually inclined aunt's bookshelf right next to her collection of healing crystals. But don't let that last bit fool you. There's a reason this book has had such staying power. Beyond the New Age packaging and Toltec wisdom branding, Ruiz offers 4 straightforward principles that can genuinely transform how you experience life. And who doesn't want that, right? Today, we're going to break down these 4 agreements, explore the philosophy behind them, and discuss practical ways to implement them in your everyday life. My goal is that by the end of this episode, you'll not only understand these agreements, but also have concrete ways to apply them to free yourself from self-limiting beliefs and unnecessary suffering. So, let's begin our journey into the 4 agreements. Background and philosophy. Before we dive into the agreements themselves, it helps to understand where they come from. Don Miguel Ruiz was born into a family of healers in rural Mexico and was expected to continue the centuries-old legacy of Toltec spiritual knowledge. But like many of us, he rebelled against his family tradition. He went to medical school and became a surgeon. Then, in the 1970s, Ruiz had a near-death experience that transformed his life. He returned to his ancestral teachings and became a Nagual, a Toltec shaman. I know. This is starting to sound like the backstory for a character in a fantasy novel, but stay with me. The Toltec were an indigenous people of Mexico who Ruiz describes as scientists and artists who formed a society to explore and conserve spiritual knowledge and practices. Think of them as ancient philosophers who were really interested in perception, consciousness, and how humans create their reality. According to Ruiz, we're all dreaming, not in the literal sleeping sense, but in how we perceive and interact with reality. We create a personal dream based on our beliefs, assumptions, and agreements we've made with ourselves and others. Most of these agreements we didn't consciously choose. They were programmed into us by our parents, teachers, religious institutions, and society at large. Ruiz calls this collective dream the domestication of humans. It's a bit like how we train dogs to sit and stay, except with people. We're trained to adopt specific beliefs about ourselves and the world. This is right. This is wrong. You are this way. People are that way. We internalize these beliefs so deeply that we don't even recognize them as separate from ourselves. And here's where things get interesting and a bit uncomfortable. According to Ruiz, this domestication creates a book of law in our minds that governs our behavior and contains all our agreements. But many of these agreements cause needless suffering because they're based on fear rather than love. For example, maybe you have an agreement that says, I need to be perfect to be worthy of love. Or, if someone criticizes me, it means I'm not good enough. These agreements create a judge in your mind that constantly criticizes you, and a victim that receives and believes the criticism. Sound familiar? If you've ever had that little voice in your head telling you you're not good enough, or you've ever laid awake at night replaying an embarrassing moment from 6 years ago, you know exactly what Ruiz is talking about. The good news is that we can replace these fear-based agreements with new ones that foster love, happiness, and freedom. That's where the 4 agreements come in. They offer an alternative code of conduct that can free us from the old agreements that create limitation and unhappiness. The first agreement: be impeccable with your word. The first agreement sounds simple. Be impeccable with your word. But what does that actually mean? Ruiz isn't just talking about keeping promises, though that's part of it. He's talking about the power of language and how we use words, both when speaking to others and, crucially, when speaking to ourselves. Impeccable comes from the Latin impeccatus, meaning without sin. Ruiz defines sin not in a religious sense, but as anything you do that goes against yourself. So, to be impeccable with your word means to use your energy in the direction of truth and love, both for yourself and others. This includes 1. Not using words to speak against yourself. No more "I'm so stupid" or "I always mess things up." 2. Not using words to gossip or speak ill of others. 3. Not using words to spread fear, anger, jealousy, or envy. 4. Using words to express your authentic truth with kindness and integrity. Ruiz claims that our word is the most powerful tool we have. It's how we manifest our intentions and create our reality. When you speak negatively about yourself, you're essentially casting a spell. Not the Harry Potter kind, but a psychological one that your subconscious accepts as truth. Think about it. How often do you say things to yourself that you would never say to a friend? You're such an idiot. You'll never succeed. No one will ever love you. Would you say these things to someone you care about? Probably not. Yet we subject ourselves to this verbal abuse constantly. Here's a personal example. I used to habitually say, "I'm terrible with names," whenever I met someone new. Lo and behold, I was indeed terrible with names. It wasn't until I caught myself doing this that I realized I was reinforcing this limitation every time I spoke it. When I changed my self-talk to "I'm working on getting better with names," my ability to remember actually improved. That's the power of being impeccable with your word. Your mind is listening, and it believes what you tell it. But this agreement extends beyond self-talk. Gossip, for instance, is a way we poison ourselves and others with words. How many times have you walked away from a gossip session feeling energized and positive? Probably never. Instead, you likely felt a mix of guilt, anxiety, and negativity. And here's where I'll inject a bit of humor. Have you ever noticed that right after you finish gossiping about someone, you suddenly feel paranoid that people are gossiping about you? It's like the universe's way of saying, "How do you like them apples?" It's karma's version of instant messaging. Being impeccable with your word also means using your words to uplift rather than tear down. This doesn't mean you can't provide criticism or feedback, but there's a difference between saying, "This report has some errors that need fixing," and "This report is a disaster, just like all your work." The challenge with this agreement is its simplicity. It's straightforward, but requires constant vigilance. How many thoughts do you have in a day? Thousands. How many times do you speak to yourself or others? Countless. Being impeccable with every word is a practice, not a one-time decision. So, how can you implement this agreement? Start small. Try a 24-hour challenge where you catch yourself every time you use words against yourself or others. Just notice. No judgment, just awareness. Then gradually extend the practice, replacing negative self-talk with more empowering language and choosing words that create positivity rather than spread poison. Remember, every word has power. Use your words to create a heaven on earth, not to create hell for yourself and others. The second agreement: don't take anything personally. Now, if the first agreement is challenging, the second one might seem nearly impossible. Don't take anything personally. Ruiz makes a bold claim here. Nothing others do is because of you. What others say and do is a projection of their own reality, their own dream. When someone gives you an opinion or criticism, it's coming from their agreements, their programming, their emotions. It has everything to do with them and nothing to do with you. I can hear some of you protesting already. But what if someone directly insults me, or criticizes my work, or breaks up with me? How is that not personal? Ruiz would say that even in those cases, the other person is acting from their own beliefs and emotions. If someone calls you stupid, it's because they have an agreement that defines stupid in a certain way, and they're projecting that agreement onto you. Their opinion is not a reflection of your actual intelligence, but a reflection of their judgment based on their own standards and biases. This doesn't mean you ignore all feedback or live in denial. If multiple people give you similar feedback, there might be something worth examining, but you can receive that information without taking it as a personal attack on your worth. Not taking things personally gives you enormous freedom. You no longer need to seek others' approval or fear their judgment. You recognize that others' opinions are just that. Opinions, not absolute truths about who you are. Here's a practical example. Imagine you give a presentation at work, and afterward, 2 colleagues give you feedback. One says it was brilliant, the best presentation they've ever seen. The other says it was confusing and missed the mark. If you take both comments personally, you're in a bind. Are you brilliant or incompetent? The truth is, you're neither. Those comments tell you more about your colleagues' expectations, preferences, and how your presentation landed with them than they do about your intrinsic worth or ability. And now, for a bit of humor. Taking things personally is like believing you're the main character in everyone else's movie. The barista gave me a funny look. She must hate me. That driver cut me off. He's trying to ruin my day. My cat knocked over the vase. She's punishing me for coming home late. Newsflash: you're the main character in your movie, but you're lucky if you even get a cameo in someone else's. Of course, not taking things personally is easier said than done. We're hardwired to care what others think of us. From an evolutionary perspective, rejection from the tribe meant death. So we developed keen sensitivity to others' opinions. But in today's world, this sensitivity often causes more harm than good. So how can you practice this agreement? Start by recognizing when you're taking something personally. Notice the emotional reaction, the hurt, the anger, the need to defend yourself. Then remind yourself, this is about them, not me. This is their movie, their dream. Ask yourself, is this actually true? Is this person's opinion or action an absolute fact about who I am? The answer is almost always no. Another helpful practice is to consider the other person's perspective. What might be going on in their life that's influencing their behavior? The grumpy cashier might be going through a divorce. The friend who snapped at you might be dealing with anxiety. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps you see that it's rarely actually about you. Not taking things personally also applies to positive comments. If someone praises you, you can appreciate it without letting it define you. Your worth doesn't increase because someone complimented you, just as it doesn't decrease because someone criticized you. This agreement offers tremendous liberation. Imagine living without the constant weight of others' opinions, both the pressure to earn praise and the fear of criticism. That's the freedom this agreement offers. The third agreement. Don't make assumptions. The third agreement builds naturally on the first two. Don't make assumptions. Humans are meaning-making machines. We hate uncertainty and ambiguity, so we fill in the gaps with assumptions. We assume we know what others are thinking. We assume others know what we want. And then we staunchly believe our assumptions are the truth. The problem? Most of our assumptions are wrong. We project our fears and expectations onto others, creating stories that often have little to do with reality. These assumptions then lead to misunderstandings, drama, and suffering. Here's a classic example. Your friend doesn't text you back for 2 days. You assume they're mad at you, so you get defensive and send a passive-aggressive message. They respond, confused, explaining that their parent was in the hospital. Now there's tension where there didn't need to be, all because of an assumption. Or consider relationships. How many arguments start with "you always" or "you never" statements? You never help around the house. You always interrupt mommy. These generalizations are assumptions that blur specific incidents into sweeping patterns, often inaccurately. The problem with assumptions is that we make them automatically and unconsciously. We don't even recognize them as assumptions. We treat them as facts. This is where the danger lies. Let me share a personal story that illustrates this. Years ago, I had a boss who rarely smiled at work. I assumed he didn't like me and probably regretted hiring me. I spent months walking on eggshells around him, overanalyzing every interaction. Eventually, during a team-building retreat, I learned that he suffered from chronic pain that made smiling uncomfortable. His serious demeanor had nothing to do with me or anyone else. That experience taught me how easily we create elaborate stories in our minds, often negative ones, based on minimal information. And now for some humor. Making assumptions is like playing detective with half the clues, and then being shocked when your brilliant deduction turns out to be completely wrong. Elementary, my dear Watson. The way she didn't use an exclamation point in her text clearly means she's plotting my demise. No, it just means she didn't use an exclamation point. So how do we stop making assumptions? Ruiz offers a simple but challenging solution. Ask questions. Have the courage to clarify. Don't assume you know what others are thinking or feeling. Don't assume others know what you need or want. This requires vulnerability and courage. It's easier to make assumptions than to ask clarifying questions. Asking questions means risking being wrong, looking ignorant, or hearing something we don't want to hear. But the alternative, living in a fiction of our own making, ultimately causes more pain. Some practical examples of replacing assumptions with questions. Instead of assuming your partner knows you want more quality time, say, "I'd really like to spend more one-on-one time together this week. How does that sound to you?" Instead of assuming your colleague is deliberately excluding you, ask, "I noticed I wasn't copied on the email thread about the project. Was that intentional, or should I be in the loop?" Instead of assuming you know what your friend meant by their cryptic comment, say, "When you said X earlier, I wasn't sure what you meant. Could you clarify that for me?" Communication is an art, and asking good questions is a crucial part of that art. The goal isn't just to avoid misunderstandings, but to truly understand others and be understood yourself. This agreement also applies to assumptions about yourself and the world. How many times have you assumed you couldn't do something without really trying? How often do you assume you know how a situation will turn out before it even begins? By letting go of assumptions, you open yourself to seeing reality more clearly and connecting with others more authentically. You replace the fantasy world of assumptions with the sometimes messy, but always richer world of reality. The fourth agreement: always do your best. The fourth and final agreement is the one that integrates the other three. Always do your best. This might sound like something your high school gym teacher would shout during track practice, but Ruiz means something more nuanced. Your best is not a fixed standard of perfection. Your best varies from moment to moment, depending on your health, energy, emotional state, and circumstances. Sometimes your best is outstanding, productive, and energetic. Other times, when you're sick or exhausted, your best might be simply getting through the day. The point is not to judge yourself against an external or fixed standard, but to give your honest best in each moment, whatever that means. This agreement protects against self-judgment and regret. If you always do your best, you can look back knowing you did all you could with what you had at the time. You avoid the poisonous what if and if only I had thoughts that create suffering. There's also a beautiful paradox in this agreement. By focusing on doing your best rather than achieving specific outcomes, you often perform better. This is because you're present and engaged rather than anxious about results. Athletes call this being in the zone or experiencing flow, that state where you're fully present and performing optimally without overthinking. Now, always do your best doesn't mean always succeed or always be perfect. It means engaging fully with whatever you're doing, giving it your honest effort under the current circumstances, and then letting go of attachment to outcomes. Here's a personal example to illustrate this. I used to be a chronic procrastinator when it came to writing projects. I'd wait until the last minute, then pull an all-nighter fueled by anxiety and caffeine. I'd submit my work and then beat myself up for not starting earlier, even if the final product was decent. This cycle was exhausting and made writing a source of stress rather than joy. When I started applying the fourth agreement, I shifted my focus from the outcome to the process. Instead of fixating on producing a perfect piece of writing, I focused on showing up each day and doing my best for that session, whether that meant writing 500 words or just editing a paragraph. Some days my best was more productive than others, but I learned to accept that without judgment. Ironically, this approach not only made writing more enjoyable, but also improved the quality of my work. And here's where I'll add a touch of humor. Doing your best doesn't mean becoming that person who turns everything into a competition, including relaxation. Oh, you took a nap? Well, I achieved a state of transcendent rest that was simultaneously productive and rejuvenating. I wrote a sonnet in my dreams. No. Sometimes your best is just taking a regular nap because you're tired. One misconception about this agreement is that it means working yourself to exhaustion. That's not doing your best. That's burning yourself out. Your best includes respecting your limits and taking care of yourself. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is rest. This agreement also doesn't mean making excuses for half-hearted efforts. It's about honesty with yourself. Did you really do your best, or did you phone it in? Only you know the truth, so how can you practice this agreement? Start by becoming aware of when you're judging your performance against an ideal rather than against your honest best in that moment. Notice when you're being too hard on yourself or when you're making excuses. Then, shift your focus from outcomes to presence and effort. Before you begin a task, set an intention to be fully present and give it your best under the current circumstances. After you finish, acknowledge your effort without judgment. This agreement becomes especially powerful when combined with the other three. When you're impeccable with your word, don't take things personally, and don't make assumptions. Doing your best comes more naturally because you're not wasting energy on self-criticism, defensiveness, or misunderstandings. Integration and application. Now that we've explored each agreement individually, let's talk about how they work together and how to apply them in daily life. These 4 agreements might seem simple, but they're not always easy. They require constant practice and awareness. You'll forget, slip back into old habits, and catch yourself breaking these agreements hundreds of times. That's normal and part of the process. Ruiz suggests an approach of gentle awareness rather than harsh self-judgment. When you notice yourself breaking an agreement, simply acknowledge it and recommit. Over time, these new agreements become more natural as they replace the old fear-based agreements in your mind. It helps to focus on one agreement at a time until it becomes more habitual before moving on to the next. Many people start with the first agreement, be impeccable with your word, because it creates a foundation for the others. Here are some practical ways to integrate these agreements into your life. Daily reflection. Take a few minutes each evening to reflect on how you practiced the agreements that day. Where did you succeed? Where did you struggle? What patterns do you notice? This builds awareness without judgment. Environmental reminders. Place visual reminders of the agreements in your environment, on your desk, as your phone background, or on your bathroom mirror. Something as simple as the words impeccable, not personal, no assumptions, my best, can trigger awareness throughout your day. Practice partners. Share these agreements with a friend, partner, or family member and practice together. Having someone who can gently point out when you might be taking something personally or making an assumption, and vice versa, accelerates growth. Specific, challenging situations. Identify specific situations where you tend to break these agreements. Maybe you take things personally during performance reviews, make assumptions with your partner, or speak negatively to yourself when stressed. Focus on applying the agreements consciously in these situations. Patience and self-compassion. Remember that you've spent your entire life under the old agreements. Changing deep-seated patterns takes time and persistent effort. Be patient with yourself and celebrate small victories along the way. The transformation process. Ruiz describes the process of adopting these agreements as a transformative journey. As you practice, you'll begin breaking free from what he calls the domestication. All those fear-based agreements you inherited and internalized throughout your life. This transformation isn't always comfortable. When you stop taking things personally, for instance, you might realize how much of your identity was built around others' opinions. When you commit to being impeccable with your word, you might become uncomfortably aware of how often you speak negatively. This discomfort is normal and actually a sign of growth. You're disrupting old patterns and creating new ones. It's like cleaning out a cluttered closet. Things might look messier temporarily as you sort through what to keep and what to discard. The good news is that practicing these agreements creates a positive cycle. Each small success builds confidence and momentum. You'll start noticing subtle shifts in how you feel and interact with the world. Relationships improve. Anxiety decreases. You'll find yourself feeling more authentic and free. Conclusion. The 4 Agreements offers a deceptively simple framework that can profoundly transform how you experience life. By being impeccable with your word, not taking anything personally, not making assumptions, and always doing your best, you free yourself from self-limiting beliefs and unnecessary suffering. These agreements challenge the fundamental ways we've been conditioned to think and behave. They invite us to question our most basic assumptions about ourselves and others. That's what makes them both difficult and powerful. What I find most valuable about Ruiz's approach is that it's both philosophical and practical. The agreements address deep existential questions about how we create meaning and identity, but they also provide concrete guidance for daily interactions and decisions. Of course, like any philosophy or self-help approach, these agreements aren't a magic cure-all. They won't solve all your problems or transform your life overnight. They require commitment, practice, and patience. But they offer a path toward greater personal freedom and authentic living. As Ruiz writes, the 4 agreements are a summary of the mastery of transformation, one of the masteries of the Toltec. In other words, these agreements are tools for transforming yourself and your experience of reality. So, I invite you to experiment with these agreements in your own life. Start small. Be gentle with yourself. Notice what shifts, and remember that the goal isn't perfection, but greater awareness and freedom. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of the 4 agreements. Until next time, be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best.